The first man who saw Samson kill Colonel Jeremiah Rutledge swore he did not see rage. He saw restraint, and that was what terrified him most. It was Thanksgiving night in 1857 at Rutledge Plantation just outside Little Rock, Arkansas, and the house was glowing with candlelight and silver and laughter while outside frost tightened its grip on the fields. Inside the dining hall, crystal glasses clinked and men toasted cotton profits and political alliances and the certainty that the world would never change. Outside in the yard, the enslaved workers stood in ordered lines waiting to be dismissed back to their quarters. Among them stood Samson, 7 feet of silent strength. A man purchased 3 years earlier under unusual documentation that described him not as field labor but as an acquisition for research purposes. Colonel Rutledge liked to call it agricultural science. He liked to say progress required vision, and vision required sacrifice. That night something shifted, witnesses later claimed. The colonel had summoned Samson into the carriage house after dinner. Some said it was discipline. Some said it was demonstration. Rutledge had been hosting investors from Louisiana and Tennessee, men interested in the whispers surrounding what he called the Strength Initiative. He had promised them proof. No one knows exactly what was said inside the carriage house, but the overseer heard a sound like oak beams straining under impossible pressure. Then silence. When the doors were forced open, minutes later they found Colonel Rutledge on the dirt floor, his neck bent at an angle no human body should allow. There were no knife wounds, no gunshot, no sign of struggle. Only deep handprints pressed into the oak support beams as if someone had gripped solid wood and squeezed. Samson was standing over the body, not panting, not trembling, simply watching, as if calculating, as if something inside him had finished a long equation. The official report would later call it a violent slave uprising, an act of savage strength, but the men who were there never used the word savage again, because savagery is chaotic. What they witnessed was precise, measured, intentional, and when they tried to seize him, the impossible happened. 2 armed guards rushed forward, iron shackles. Ready, Samson stepped toward them. One chain snapped in his hands like thread. The second he twisted apart without visible effort. A third man raised a pistol. Samson did not flinch. He moved faster than anyone expected, and the weapon flew from the guards, grip embedding itself in the carriage wall. No one died except the colonel. That detail would haunt investigators for years. Samson could have killed them all. Instead, he walked out of the carriage house, across the yard past rows of stunned witnesses, and into the tree line. By dawn, he was gone. The story might have ended there, another plantation tragedy buried beneath fear and rumor, except for the documents, because when federal marshals arrived days later, they discovered Rutledge's private study had been stripped, not looted, selected research journals, gone, correspondence missing, financial ledgers removed with care, the safes containing cash untouched, but every file marked strength assessment missing. That was when the Pinkerton Agency became involved, officially. They were investigating a murder. Unofficially, they were sent because someone in Washington feared something much larger. Rutledge had northern connections, investors from Boston, medical consultants from Philadelphia, letters bearing seals of organizations. That did not officially exist. One name appeared repeatedly in surviving correspondence: Meridian Research Associates. The more the Pinkertons uncovered, the stranger it became. Samson had not been acquired through ordinary slave auctions. His bill of sale referenced medical anomalies, exceptional muscular density, accelerated recovery, unusual cognitive aptitude. He had been tested, measured, observed, and modified agents interviewed plantation workers who spoke quietly about nightly visits to a laboratory hidden beneath the carriage house, about injections, about strange tonics, about the colonel boasting that he was perfecting the future of labor. A stronger worker, a smarter overseer, an improved human asset. The language in those notes chilled, even hardened investigators. Enhanced, yield through biological optimization, behavioral compliance monitoring, neural resilience thresholds. Samson was not simply enslaved, he had been engineered, and now he was free. Rumors began spreading through Arkansas territory of a massive figure moving through forests faster than horses, of a man who lifted fallen wagons from trapped families, of a shadow that appeared near plantations days before slaves vanished. At first, authorities dismissed these stories as frontier superstition, until October. That was when 3 enslaved men at a plantation near Camden broke their shackles. Not picked the locks. Not escaped under cover of darkness. They twisted solid iron apart. The overseer who survived said they moved like soldiers, coordinated, disciplined, silent. Hey, destroyed every chain on the property before leaving, every restraint, every iron bar as if making a statement. Within weeks, similar incidents followed in Mississippi and Louisiana. Research facilities raided documents, burned subjects freed. No random violence. No. Slaughter-only targeted destruction, and at each site investigators found the same symbol carved into wood or stone broken shackles. The Pinkertons began to suspect the unthinkable. Samson was not hiding, he was organizing, but organizing what an uprising an army, or something more calculated. Dr. Marcus Kleinman, a German researcher connected to Meridian, was summoned to testify in secret before federal officials. He admitted under pressure that the enhancement program had expanded beyond agriculture. He had attempted to create superior soldiers workers immune to exhaustion, men capable of surviving extreme conditions, but there had been side effects: increased memory retention, accelerated learning, strategic cognition. Subjects began asking questions, refusing. Commands analyzing the structure of their confinement. According to Kleinman, Samson represented the highest enhancement level ever achieved: 4 times normal human strength, expanded intellectual capacity, heightened perception. But what frightened him most was not the strength, it was autonomy. Samson had begun studying the very research conducted on him, learning the process, understanding its limits, and perhaps discovering how to replicate or counteract it. By winter of 1858, Washington officials were receiving reports that foreign observers had taken interest. British intelligence agents in New Orleans asking about agricultural experiments. French envoys inquiring about biological advancement. If enhanced men existed beyond American control, the balance of power could shift. The Pinkerton investigation was quietly terminated. That June files sealed agents reassigned, but the crisis did not fade. Sightings increased. Native tribes in Arkansas spoke of a towering man who ran beside rivers without tiring, who spoke gently, who asked questions about freedom in the ruins of Rutledge Plantation. Visitors reported the oak handprints growing darker with time, as if the wood itself refused to forget. By autumn, whispers turned into fear. Plantation owners demanded protection, military officials drafted contingency plans, and bounty hunters like Thomas Bogard began tracking. The legend: Bogard claimed he saw Samson once in a canyon near the Buffalo River. Said the man stood 30 feet above him on a stone. Ledge said he felt measured, not threatened, calculated, not hunted. According to Bogard, Samson spoke clearly. "You are chasing the wrong enemy. Men like me are not the danger. The danger is what you built." Then he stepped backward off the cliff and vanished, without leaving tracks. By the end of that year, the name Samson was no longer spoken as that of a fugitive slave. It was spoken as a problem, a crisis, a symbol. Because what terrified the government was not a single enhanced man roaming the frontier, and was the possibility that the experiment had succeeded too well, that those once treated as property had become stronger than their masters, smarter than their creators, and unwilling to remain silent. The nation was already fracturing over slavery. This was something new. This was not a rebellion of chains. It was a rebellion of evolution. And somewhere beyond the tree line where the frost still clung to Arkansas soil, Samson was moving. Not like prey, but like a man who understood that the first chain to break is not iron, it is fear, and once fear snaps, everything else follows. The first plantation burned without a scream. No gunshots, no panicked shouting, no bodies in the fields. By dawn, the main house at Blackwater Estate was nothing but a skeleton of charred beams. The overseer was found bound to a sycamore tree, unharmed but shaking so violently he could not speak. The slave quarters stood empty. Every man, woman, and child was gone, and carved into the barn door, cut deep enough to split the wood grain, were 3 words: "We are free." The South did not panic at first. Plantation owners were used to runaways. They were used to small rebellions, to defiance that could be crushed quietly and brutally. But this was different. Within 2 weeks, 5 more estates reported the same pattern: no casualties, no bloodshed, total liberation, and something else. Each site had been dismantled with precision, ledgers destroyed, keys taken, weapons removed, horses released. This wasn't chaos. It was strategy. In Little Rock, Colonel James Hargrove stared at the growing pile of reports on his desk. He had served in skirmishes against outlaws and in border conflicts. He understood disorder. He understood rage. This was neither. This is military, he muttered. Across the table, Pinkerton investigator Elias Boone shook his head. With respect, Colonel, these are farmhands. Hargrove slid a report forward. Farmhands don't disable guard rotations without a single alarm sounding. They don't move 50 people across county lines overnight without leaving tracks. And they don't leave messages. Boone hesitated. Messages? Hargrove opened a second report, carved into the foundation stone of Red Willow Plantation. The chains taught us patience. A third report, written in ink across a laboratory, ledger found at a burned facility in Tennessee. You made us strong. You forgot to keep us loyal. Boone swallowed. This was no scattered uprising. This was organized. 3 nights later, the myth became flesh. A freight warehouse along the Mississippi River had been converted, quietly, into a government-funded agricultural enhancement laboratory. Officially, it was studying crop resilience. Unofficially, it was experimenting on men, chemical regimens, endurance trials, neural stimulation, pain conditioning. The goal was simple: produce laborers who did not break. The experiment had been classified until midnight. The guards later claimed the door did not open. It splintered. Witnesses described a man stepping through shattered oak like mist through curtains. He was massive, taller than any man present, shoulders broad enough to eclipse lantern light. But it was not just his size that paralyzed them, it was his composure. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if time bent around him. One guard raised a rifle. The man took it from him without visible effort, snapped it across his knee. Then he spoke. Unlock them. The guards obeyed. Inside the lower holding chamber were 12 test subjects. Bruised, scarred, injected beyond reason. The massive figure stepped toward them. You remember who you are? He said quietly. Something passed between them. Not spoken, not visible, but undeniable. Recognition, understanding, awakening. Within minutes, the laboratory was stripped of every document, every chemical vial, every instrument of restraint. And before leaving, the towering man carved a final message into the brick wall with his bare hand. The experiment ends tonight. That was the first confirmed sighting of the man they would come to call Samson. Word spread faster than the authorities could suppress it. Whispers in cotton fields, rumors in docks and rail yards, murmurs in church basements. A giant who walked, without fear. A liberator who harmed no innocent. A strategist who struck only where cruelty hid. But while enslaved communities began to hope, plantation owners began to arm themselves, militias formed. Bounty prices doubled, federal interest intensified, because now Washington was involved. Dr. Matthias Klein, architect of the enhancement trials, had been summoned under sealed orders. Arrived pale, exhausted, and haunted. You were supposed to increase physical tolerance, a senator snapped during a closed hearing. Why are they coordinating? Klein's voice trembled. We altered more than muscle density. The neural stimulants increased cognitive connectivity, pattern recognition, strategic processing. English, doctor. Klein swallowed. We made them think better, faster. Together. Silence filled the chamber. You're suggesting telepathy? Another official scoffed. No, Klein said quickly. Not mystical, but synchronized. Shared trauma can create powerful psychological bonds, and we subjected them to identical stimuli for years, identical stress, identical conditioning. You trained them, the senator realized. Klein closed his eyes. Yes. Meanwhile, Samson did not hide. He was seen standing on a ridge outside Natchez at dusk, surveying a plantation before it fell the next night. He was spotted walking openly through a marketplace in Baton Rouge, no one daring to stop him. Thomas Bogard, the bounty hunter who had once nearly tracked him, refused to take the contract when offered again. You don't hunt a hurricane, Bogard said. You survive it. But not everyone feared him. Some feared what he might inspire. By early spring, free black communities in northern states began reporting mysterious visitors. Men bearing scars from laboratories, men who spoke of organization, of safe routes, of hidden settlements forming beyond mapped territory. Not revenge, refuge. They were building something, and that terrified Washington more than fire ever could, because revolutions could be crushed. But civilizations, they endured. The turning point came in April. A plantation owner in Georgia attempted to stage a trap. He spread word that he possessed information leading to Samson's location. He tightened security, loaded rifles, hired mercenaries. Samson came, anyway, but he did not come alone. Witnesses reported seeing shadows move with impossible coordination, lanterns extinguished in perfect sequence, weapons removed from hands before fingers tightened, and when the smoke cleared, every captive was gone. The plantation owner was left alive, seated at his own dining table. On the table lay every experiment ledger he had funded, every payment record, every signed authorization, stacked neatly, and atop them, a note, confess. He did, publicly. Within days, newspapers across northern states printed the story of illegal experimentation on enslaved men. The nation began to fracture along new lines. Not just slavery, science, morality, power. What had they created, and who truly controlled it now? By May 1859, military advisors presented an unthinkable proposal. Deploy full federal force, hunt down every enhanced subject, neutralize them permanently. But when scouts attempted to track known escape routes, they found something unsettling. Abandoned camps, still warm. Watch points positioned with military precision, false trails, counter-surveillance patterns. Samson was not reacting. He was anticipating, and then came the moment that changed everything. Just before dawn, as fog rolled over the Potomac, a lone figure stood at the edge of Washington City, 7 feet tall, unarmed, unhidden. He walked toward the Capitol as citizens froze in the streets. No guards fired, no soldiers advanced. He climbed the marble steps, slowly, deliberately, and pressed his palm against the stone. When he removed it, the imprint remained, cracked, indented, impossible. And beneath it, carved with a fingertip, you cannot own what you cannot control. By the time soldiers reached the steps, he was gone, vanished into the morning mist. But the message remained, not just on stone, in the minds of everyone who saw it. The South armed itself. The North debated itself. The government divided against itself, and, somewhere beyond the maps, beyond the plantations and laboratories, beyond the reach of fear, Samson was no longer freeing men. He was building a future. The fire had spread, and it was no longer possible to tell whether it would burn the old world down or forge a new one from its ashes. The government made its decision in silence, no declaration, no public address, no newspaper headline. But on June 3, 1859, 3 regiments were quietly reassigned across Arkansas, Tennessee, and Mississippi. Rail lines were secured. Telegraph. Stations monitored. Known sympathizers questioned. The official wording read, containment of insurrectionary elements. Unofficially, they were hunting Samson. The first clash happened outside Helena, Arkansas. Scouts had reported movement near an abandoned lumber mill, suspected to be a coordination point for liberated men. At dawn, federal troops surrounded the perimeter. Rifles loaded, orders clear, capture if possible, kill if necessary. What they found inside was not an army. It was a classroom. Dozens of formerly enslaved men sat around crude wooden tables. Maps spread out, supplies organized, children learning letters in the corner, and at the front of the room stood Samson. He did not reach for a weapon. He stepped forward calmly. "You were sent to stop violence," he said to the commanding officer. "Look around you." The officer hesitated, because there were no weapons drawn, no battle formations, no chaos, only preparation for survival. Then a single rifle misfired. No one ever confirmed who pulled the trigger, but the sound shattered everything. Tom. The split second that followed, soldiers expected slaughter. Instead, something far more terrifying happened. Samson moved, not with rage, not with frenzy, but with surgical precision. He disarmed 3 men in less time than it takes to blink. Rifles snapped cleanly, bayonets bent, ammunition scattered. Around him, the liberated men acted in perfect coordination, securing exits, shielding children, neutralizing threats without lethal force. Within 90 seconds, 50 armed soldiers stood disarmed, alive, humiliated, staring at a force they could not overpower. Samson walked to the commanding officer and placed the broken barrel of a rifle back into his shaking hands. "We are not your enemy," he said quietly. "But we will not kneel again." The troops retreated, and word spread. The government had sent soldiers, and the soldiers had failed. Washington could no longer pretend this was localized unrest. This was disciplined resistance. President Buchanan convened a private war council. The room was divided. One faction demanded overwhelming force. Arrest sympathizers, execute leaders, make an example. The other warned of consequences. "These men are not hiding," Senator Clay argued. "They are making statements. They're freeing captives and dismantling illegal operations. If we escalate, we validate their cause. And if we don't," a general snapped, "we admit we've lost control." Control. That was the word that hung over every decision. Because the deeper truth was beginning to surface, the enhancement programs had not simply created stronger laborers. They had created leaders, men forced into shared suffering, shared experimentation, shared awakening. And Samson was no longer just their liberator. He was their strategist. By midsummer, the network had grown beyond plantations. Blacksmiths quietly forged tools. Dock workers rerouted supplies. Free communities in the north began receiving organized arrivals. Families escorted safely across hostile territory. And in the Appalachian foothills, rumors spread of something impossible. A settlement, not a camp, not a hideout. A settlement, structured cabins. Crops planted, watchposts positioned, defensive routes mapped. It was not rebellion. It was construction. When federal scouts finally located the settlement's outer perimeter, they did not attack immediately. They observed. What they saw disturbed them more than any battle report. Children, studying under lantern light, men building irrigation systems, women organizing supply inventories, rotating patrols structured like military units, but never aggressive. And at the center, Samson, listening more than speaking. This was not chaos, it was governance. Back in Tennessee, Dr. Matthias Klein received a visitor late one evening. He opened the door expecting soldiers. Instead, he found one of his former subjects. The man did not threaten him. He handed him a document, a proposal. Inside were structured demands, immediate termination of all human experimentation programs, amnesty for liberated subjects, legal recognition as free citizens, federal investigation into illegal research funding. Klein's hands trembled as he read. "They sent you?" he asked. The man shook his head. "We sent ourselves." "Samson?" A pause. "He doesn't command us. He reminds us." "Of what?" The man met his eyes. "That we are not what you made us. We are what we choose to become." And then he left. The proposal reached Congress within weeks. Debate ignited like dry timber. Southern representatives called it blackmail. Northern abolitionists called it proof of moral reckoning. Military leaders called it a security threat. But the public began asking new questions. If these men were monsters, why weren't they killing? If they were savage, why were they building schools? If they were dangerous, why were they asking for recognition instead of revenge? The narrative was shifting, and that terrified the powerful. Then came the sabotage of Fort Adams. Not an attack, a demonstration. At dawn, soldiers discovered every cannon at the fort had been rendered inoperable overnight. Firing pins removed, powder, stores soaked, no guards harmed, no alarms triggered. On the main gate hung a banner. Power without justice collapses. It was a warning, not a threat. The government could escalate, but it would not win easily. Tension reached its peak in August. Secret directive authorized a specialized strike unit, hand-picked soldiers trained specifically to counter enhanced subjects. Their objective, capture Samson, alive if possible. The ambush was set near the Cumberland Gap. What the strike unit did, not realize, was that Samson knew, because he had studied them long before they studied him. When they engaged, it was the closest the conflict came to true battle. Smoke bombs deployed, coordinated flanking maneuvers, precision rifle shots aimed to disable. For the first time, Samson fought back with visible force. He moved like controlled thunder, disarming, deflecting, dismantling strategy mid-motion, but again, no killing. When the dust settled, the elite unit lay restrained but breathing. Their commander looked up at Samson and whispered, "Why won't you finish it?" Samson's answer was simple. "Because if I become what you expect, you win." He released them, sent them back with a message. "We are not the storm you fear. We are the consequence." By autumn 1859, the United States stood on the brink, not just of civil war, but of something stranger. A new class of citizen existed, stronger, faster, strategic, but morally deliberate, and led not by domination, but by restraint. The government could no longer paint them as beasts, nor could it openly admit creating them. The country was fracturing along invisible fault lines. Slavery, science, authority, freedom. And in the forest beyond the reach of Washington, lanterns glowed each night in the growing settlement. Maps expanded, fields harvested, plans drafted. Samson stood at the edge of the clearing one evening, watching the sunset burn red across the horizon. A young boy approached him. "Are they coming back?" The boy asked. "Yes," Samson said. "Will we fight?" Samson looked at the settlement, the schoolhouse, the crops, the families. "We will endure." Because this was no longer about escape. It was about existence. And existence, once claimed, is nearly impossible to take back. By the winter of 1859, the United States no longer felt like one country. It felt like dry timber waiting for a match. Newspapers screamed about rebellion. Southern editorials warned of engineered uprisings. Northern presses printed exposés about illegal human experimentation. Politicians accused each other of treason. Militias drilled in town squares. Church sermons turned apocalyptic. And somewhere between outrage and denial stood a truth no one wanted to say aloud. The government had created something it could not control, and now that creation was forcing the nation to confront itself. In the foothills beyond the Cumberland Gap, the settlement had grown into something undeniable. Not a camp, not a rebellion, a community. Cabins now formed organized rows. Watchtowers were positioned along natural ridgelines. Crops rotated efficiently. A central hall served as both council, chamber, and schoolhouse. Formerly enslaved men and women worked beside freed laborers from northern states. They built irrigation channels, crafted tools, wrote letters, taught children to read. They were not hiding. They were preparing, but not for war, for permanence. Samson rarely spoke during council meetings. He listened, because this was no longer about him. It was about what came next. We cannot stay invisible. Forever, said Elijah, one of the earliest liberated men. They're consolidating troops along the southern border counties. And northern politicians want to use us as leverage, added Miriam, who oversaw supply logistics, to force abolition faster. Samson nodded slowly. We will not become anyone's weapon, he said. That was the line they held. No allegiance to the Confederacy forming in whispers. No allegiance to federal opportunists. They belonged to neither side, and that made both sides nervous. In Washington, the War Council had shifted tone. Containment had failed, intimidation had failed, elite capture attempts had failed. Now came the most dangerous proposal yet, weaponization. If we cannot suppress them, General Rathbone said, leaning over the polished table, we replicate them. Dr. Klein, pale and hollow-eyed, felt his stomach drop. You cannot be serious. Rathbone didn't blink. Accelerated enhancement trials. Controlled subjects. Military loyalty embedded from inception. You don't understand what you're suggesting, Klein whispered. I understand perfectly, Rathbone snapped. The South is arming. Secession talks are no longer rumors. If civil war erupts, enhanced soldiers could decide it in weeks. And if they turn? Klein asked quietly. Silence. Because they all remembered Helena, Fort Adams, Cumberland Gap. Enhanced men had refused to kill, even when justified. What would happen if the next generation was taught to obey without question? Word of the proposal leaked, not through spies, through conscience. One of the junior officers assigned to the program defected. He rode north under cover of night and disappeared into the mountains. 3 days later, he stood before Samson. I was ordered to help build an army like you, he said, hands trembling. Only this time, obedient. The settlement grew very still. Samson's jaw tightened. How far have they progressed? Blueprints, chemical revisions. They think they can remove the autonomy. Miriam stepped forward. Can they? All eyes turned to Samson. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. They can try. The South moved first. In February 1860, a coalition of plantation owners funded a private militia tasked with hunting the settlement directly. Unlike federal troops, these men were not bound by congressional oversight. They were fueled by revenge and fear. They struck at dawn. Not with strategy, with fire. Cabins burned at the perimeter before alarms sounded. Smoke tore through the valley. Gunshots echoed across frostbitten ground. For the first time, the settlement was under true assault. Samson moved through the chaos like a controlled inferno. He overturned wagons to create barricades, redirected attackers without lethal strikes, pulled children from burning structures, coordinated defenders with precise hand signals. But this enemy did not retreat when disarmed. They came to kill, and restraint has limits. When one militia leader aimed a pistol at a fleeing child, Samson crossed the distance in a heartbeat. He did not hesitate. He struck once. The man fell, alive, but broken. The message was clear. Mercy remained, but so did consequence. By midday, the militia scattered. Half fled, half surrendered. The settlement still stood, scarred, smoking but standing. That night, the council gathered in the half-burned hall. Something had shifted. They will escalate, Elijah said. Yes, Samson replied. And if the federal government creates its own enhanced soldiers, Miriam pressed. Silence stretched long. Finally, Samson spoke. Then we stop them before they begin. It was the first offensive decision he had ever endorsed. In March 1860, a covert team from the settlement moved toward a newly constructed research facility outside Richmond. This was not liberation, this was prevention. They moved with surgical coordination. Supply lines cut, rail switches altered, telegraph wires severed. When they reached the facility, they found something unexpected. Volunteers, young men promised strength and honor, unaware of what true enhancement meant. Samson stepped into the laboratory floor and addressed them directly. "They told you this would make you powerful," he said. "They did not tell you it would make you property." Some scoffed, some listened. One by one, the volunteers walked away from the program. The scientists were left standing amid dismantled equipment and shattered illusions. No bloodshed. But the program collapsed. Back in Washington, panic turned into something darker, not fear of Samson, fear of irrelevance. The country was spiraling toward civil war. South Carolina whispered secession openly now. Northern states hardened their stance, and in the middle of it all stood a third force, independent, disciplined, impossible to manipulate. A senator finally voiced the unthinkable. "What if we negotiate?" The room recoiled. Negotiate? Rathbone spat. "With experimental subjects? With citizens," the senator corrected, because that was the word no one had dared use. Citizens. As spring thawed into summer, the nation cracked. South Carolina formally declared secession in December 1860. The Union trembled, and letters began arriving at the settlement. From abolitionists, from frightened families, from soldiers questioning orders, from politicians seeking alliance. Samson read them all, and burned most. They would not become a banner for either side. But when Fort Sumter fell, and the first official shots of the Civil War rang out in April 1861, the world changed. The settlement gathered in the central field as distant thunder rolled across the mountains. "Will we join?" a young defender asked. Samson looked toward the horizon, where smoke from distant battles stained the sky. "No," he said. "Then what do we do?" He turned back to the community, the children, the elders, the scarred, and the strong. "We survived the war they built. Because the fracture was complete now, the Union and Confederacy would tear each other apart. And when the smoke cleared, something new would be required, not domination, not experimentation, but leadership born from restraint." Samson understood something the politicians did not. Empires collapse from pride. Nations rebuild from conscience, and in the ashes of civil war, the world would be ready to listen. The Civil War did not end in thunder. It ended in exhaustion. By the spring of 1865, the South was splintered, its rail lines broken, its cities hollowed by smoke. The Union stood victorious, but not untouched. Fields across the nation lay quiet where young men once stood. Families waited for footsteps that would never return. Slavery had collapsed. The Confederacy had fallen. But victory did not feel like peace. It felt like survival, and survival leaves questions behind. Far from the ruined capitals and shattered plantations, the settlement in the mountains endured. They had stayed out of the war, not out of indifference, but out of clarity. While armies clashed and flags burned, they had built schools, planted crops, reinforced watchtowers, expanded trade routes with quiet northern allies. They did not fight for either banner. They prepared for what would follow, because Samson had always understood something simple. War ends. Power struggles do. Not news of the Confederacy's surrender reached the settlement on a cool April morning. A rider arrived breathless from Tennessee waving a folded newspaper. "It's done," he said. The hall filled quickly. Men and women who had once been counted as property stood shoulder to shoulder reading words that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Slavery abolished. Reconstruction promised. The Union preserved. Silence fell after the reading. Elijah was the first to speak. "So what happens now?" It was the question hanging over the entire nation, and Samson did not answer immediately. Because this moment had never been about victory. It had been about choice. In Washington, the mood was complicated. The government had survived civil war, but only barely. Trust was fragile. The treasury strained. Political factions sharpened knives behind polite smiles, and then someone reopened a file that had not been touched in years. Project Enhancement. Reports of Samson. The settlement. the neutral force that had refused to join either side. President Andrew Johnson, newly sworn in after Lincoln's assassination, reviewed the documents with narrowed eyes. They could have ended the war in months, one general muttered. On either side. But they didn't, Johnson said quietly. That restraint unsettled him more than aggression ever had, because it suggested independence, and independence is difficult to command. A delegation was formed. Not soldiers, not spies, politicians. They traveled under a white flag of diplomacy into the Appalachian foothills. For the first time in American history, the federal government sought formal dialogue with the men it had once classified as experimental assets. The delegation entered the settlement cautiously. They expected fortifications. They expected suspicion. They found structure. Children studying, arithmetic in open-air classrooms, blacksmiths crafting tools. A council hall rebuilt stronger than before, and at its center stood Samson. He had not aged the way ordinary men did. The enhancements had altered more than strength. Time seemed reluctant to claim him, but his eyes carried the weight of every year since emancipation began in fire. The lead senator stepped forward. "We come to offer recognition." A murmur rippled through the gathered community. "Recognition," the senator continued, "as free citizens of the United States, amnesty for all past actions, protection under federal law." Samson regarded him steadily. "And in return?" he asked. The senator hesitated. Integration. There it was, the unspoken expectation. Disband, dissolve, become ordinary, become manageable. Samson walked slowly toward the edge of the clearing, where the mountains rose like silent witnesses. "You ask us to join a nation that once engineered our chains," he said calmly. "You ask us to trust institutions that tried to replicate us as weapons." "That government is gone," the senator insisted. "No," Samson replied softly. "It remains, reconstructed." Silence stretched long between them. Finally, Miriam stepped forward. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked. The senator straightened. "Citizenship, land rights, legal protection, representation." It was more than anyone had imagined, possible 10 years earlier. But it was not freedom without conditions. Samson turned back to his people. "Shall we decide how he asked, because leadership, he had learned, is not command. It is consent. The council met for 3 days. Voices rose. Memories resurfaced. Some wanted full integration, believing change must be claimed from within. Others wanted continued independence, arguing that power structures rebuild themselves quietly. On the final evening, a young woman named Ruth stood to speak. She had been a child in the first liberation. "At Blackwater Estate, I don't want to hide anymore," she said. "But I don't want to be used again either." Her words settled like truth across the room. They did not want isolation. They did not want domination. They wanted acknowledgement. On their terms. The agreement drafted in the mountains would become known, quietly, as the Appalachian Accord. It granted federal citizenship to every member of the settlement. It recognized their land as protected territory under constitutional law. It prohibited any future human experimentation without explicit congressional oversight and consent, and most importantly, it recognized enhanced individuals as autonomous persons, not government property. The signing took place not in Washington, but in the settlement itself, a deliberate reversal of power. When Samson pressed his name into the parchment, the moment felt less like triumph and more like closure. The experiment was over, officially, but something else had shifted too. During Reconstruction, as the South struggled to redefine itself, stories of the settlement spread. Not exaggerated myths of giants tearing down buildings, but stories of restraint, of a force strong enough to dominate, choosing instead to build. Young lawmakers visited the mountains seeking counsel. Military officers studied their defensive strategies, not for suppression, but for reform. Scholars wrote papers about shared resilience and psychological synchronization born of trauma. The nation began to understand something it had missed entirely. Strength without conscience destroys. Strength with restraint transforms. Years passed. The settlement evolved into a town. Trade routes expanded. Schools flourished. Enhanced and non-enhanced citizens lived side by side. Samson gradually stepped back from public leadership. He never sought office, never accepted military rank. He walked the perimeter at dawn, sat in classrooms at dusk. He preferred watching foundations hold rather than standing atop them. One evening, Elijah joined him on the ridge overlooking the valley. "Do you ever regret not taking more?" Elijah asked. Samson considered the question carefully. "We were given power without choice," he said. "The only way to remain free was to choose what not to do with it." Below them, lanterns flickered to life one by one. Children laughed in the distance. The sound carried clean and unafraid. "That's enough," Samson said quietly. By the turn of the century, the legend of Samson had grown beyond fact. Some claimed he could still split stone with his hands. Others believed he had vanished into the wilderness. The truth was simpler. He aged slowly. He lived quietly. And one winter morning, decades after the war, he did not rise with the sun. No dramatic end, no battlefield, no monument carved from marble. He was buried on the ridge overlooking the town he had helped create. No grand epitaph marked his grave, only a single line etched into modest stone. Freedom requires strength. Wisdom decides how to use it. The United States moved forward, flawed, evolving, imperfect. But one truth remained embedded in its history. At the brink of collapse, when power sought to dominate and fear sought to control, a group of men once treated as property chose restraint over revenge, and by refusing to become what they were engineered to be, they changed the nation more deeply than any war, because empires fall from violence, nations endure through choice, and sometimes, the greatest revolution is not the one that conquers, but the one that refuses to.